In the unforgiving heart of the American West, where canyons whisper secrets and survival is a daily prayer, a lone widow's life was changed forever. This isn't just a story of grit. It's the true account of Eleanor Vance, a woman who risked everything for two lost children from a world not her own. She offered them shelter, but what she received in return was a test of fire, a confrontation with fearful neighbors, the cold steel of the law, and a band of armed Navajo riders descending on her isolated ranch. This is the story of how one woman's courage echoed through the canyons, forging an honor that could only be paid in blood and respect. The Arizona Territory in 1888 was a land of brutal contradictions. It was a place where breathtaking beauty, painted in strokes of ochre crimson and violet across vast canyons, stood in stark contrast to the unforgiving harshness of life itself. For Eleanor Vance, the beauty and the brutality were two sides of the same coin, a constant presence she breathed in with the dust-tinged air of her isolated homestead. Her small, sturdy ranch house, built with her late husband's hands, was perched on the precipice of a world overlooking the deep, shadowed gash of Canyon de Chelly. It had been 3 years since the fever took Samuel. 3 years of a silence so profound it had its own sound, a low hum of loneliness that vibrated in the floorboards and echoed in the empty space beside her in their bed. Samuel had been a geologist, a man obsessed with the stories told by rocks. He saw poetry in strata history, in fossils. He had chosen this spot not for its ranching potential, but for its proximity to the canyon, his stone library. Eleanor, a city-bred woman from Philadelphia, had followed him, her love for the man eclipsing her fear of the wilderness. Now, the wilderness was all she had left of him. Her days were a metronome of survival. She tended her small flock of sheep, their bleating a welcome interruption to the quiet. She maintained the vegetable garden Samuel had laid out, coaxing life from the dry soil with a patience born of necessity. She read his books in the evening, the heavy geological tomes, a comfort, their dense scientific language, a connection to his mind. She was not just surviving, she was enduring. A solitary figure etched against a landscape of raw, magnificent emptiness. The people in the nearest settlement, Chinle, a dusty collection of buildings that served as a trading post and a point of entry for the U.S. Army, kept their distance. They saw her as an oddity, the widow Vance, the educated woman who chose solitude over the grim comfort of their society. They whispered about her, some with pity, others with suspicion. Why would a woman stay out there alone, especially so close to the Navajo reservation? The Dines, as they called themselves, were a proud, resilient people recently returned from their forced exile at Bosque Redondo. Tensions between the settlers and the Navajo were a constant simmering pot, always threatening to boil over. Eleanor, however, harbored no fear of them. Samuel had respected them, had even learned a few words of their language, admiring their deep connection to the very land he studied. It was on a sweltering afternoon in late August that the metronome of her life shattered. A storm had rolled in the night before a violent theatrical display of nature's power. Lightning had clawed at the sky, and thunder had cannonaded through the canyon, shaking the very foundations of her house. Now, the aftermath was a world washed clean, the air crisp, the scent of wet sage and juniper rising from the earth. Concerned about a section of fence near the canyon rim that was prone to washing out, Eleanor saddled her steady mare Juniper and rode out. The sun beat down, and the rocks radiated a dry heat. She followed the familiar trail, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape. As she neared the edge of a smaller branching canyon, a tributary to the main gorge, she heard a sound that did not belong to the usual chorus of the wild. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the chatter of a squirrel. It was faint, thin, and unmistakably human. A child's cry. Eleanor pulled Juniper to a halt, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs. She listened, holding her breath. There it was again, weaker this time, almost stolen by the breeze. Dismounting, she tied Juniper's reins to a sturdy greasewood bush and crept toward the canyon edge, her stomach tightened with a knot of dread. The flash floods that tore through these narrow canyons after a storm were death traps powerful enough to move boulders and strip trees from their roots. She lay on her stomach, the warm sandstone, scratching her forearms, and peered over the edge, her breath caught in her throat. About 20 feet down, on a narrow ledge that had been carved out by centuries of rushing water, were two small children. They were huddled together, their dark hair matted with mud, their traditional woven clothing torn and soaked. One, a boy, was standing looking up with wide, terrified eyes. The other, a girl who looked to be his twin, was lying on her side, her body trembling. The ledge they were on was an island of fragile safety. Above them was a sheer, unclimbable wall. Below them, a dizzying drop to the canyon floor, which was littered with the debris of the flood, splintered logs, uprooted cacti, and a slick, dark mud. They were trapped. They were Navajo children. She could tell by their features, their clothing, and the simple silver and turquoise bracelet on the boy's wrist. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through Eleanor. Not for herself, but for them. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. How had they gotten here? Where were their parents? The boy saw her. His cry ceased, replaced by a frozen, silent terror. He grabbed his sister's shoulder, pulling her closer. Eleanor's mind raced. The settlement was hours away. Even if she could get Marshal Thompson, he wouldn't arrive until nightfall. These children didn't have that long. The girl looked weak, and the sun was relentless. She had to act, now. "It's all right," she called down, her voice softer than she intended, almost a whisper. "I'm here to help." The words were useless, she knew. They wouldn't understand English. She remembered some of the Navajo words. Samuel had taught her words for trading simple greetings. Nothing for a situation like this. She had to rely on something more universal than language. Thinking quickly, she ran back to Juniper, her mind a whirlwind of Samuel's lessons. He had taught her about knots, about anchors, about the physics of ropes and weight. He had a long, sturdy lariat in his old gear, one he used for lowering equipment. She rummaged through her saddlebags, her hands shaking slightly. She found the rope thick and reassuringly heavy. Returning to the edge, she worked with a desperate focus. She found a massive, deeply rooted juniper tree several feet back from the precipice to serve as her anchor. She looped the rope around its thick trunk, testing it, pulling with all her weight. It held firm. She tied a loop at the end of the rope, a bowline knot, the king of knots, as Samuel had called it, because it would not slip or tighten under load. She looked down at the children again. The boy was still watching her, his small body tense as a drawn bowstring. "I'm going to lower the rope," she said, speaking slowly and calmly, hoping her tone would convey her intent. She mimed pulling something up, hand over hand. "I will pull you up. Do you understand?" He just stared. Eleanor knew she had only one chance to gain his trust. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and began to lower the rope. The rope snaked down the rock face, a lifeline of hemp, against the red stone. It landed on the ledge with a soft thud a few feet from the children. The boy, whose name she would later learn was Ashki, which meant simply boy, in the Diné language, flinched as if it were a striking serpent. He stood protectively in front of his sister, Ataye'd girl, shielding her small, shivering form from the strange object and the even stranger woman above. Eleanor's heart ached for them. She saw not just two lost children, but the embodiment of all the fear and vulnerability she herself had felt in this vast, indifferent land. She had to quell her own panic to soothe theirs. "It's okay," she repeated, her voice a low murmur. She pointed to the loop, then to herself, and made the pulling motion again. "Nijoni," she said, recalling one of Samuel's words. "It is good, beautiful." It was inadequate, but it was all she had. Ashki did not move. His dark eyes, impossibly large in his small, mud-streaked face, were fixed on her. He was assessing her, weighing the danger of the strange white woman against the certain peril of their situation. Eleanor could see the fierce intelligence in his gaze, the premature gravity of a child forced to confront mortality. She realized she had to demonstrate. But how? She couldn't very well rappel down herself. Then an idea sparked: her canteen. It was nearly full and heavy. Unstrapping it from her belt, she tied its leather strap securely to the main rope a few feet above the bowline loop. With painstaking care, she lowered it down to the ledge. "Tow," she said, pointing at the canteen. "Water. For your sister." She pointed at the girl, then mimed drinking. This finally seemed to break through the boy's paralysis. He watched the canteen swing gently, his gaze flickering to his sister, who had begun to emit a soft whimpering moan. Her need was greater than his fear. With a caution that was heartbreaking to witness, Ashki crept forward. He touched the canteen hesitantly, then untied it. He uncorked it with fumbling fingers and shuffled back to his sister. He lifted her head, gently pouring a small amount of water onto his hand, first to test it before letting a few precious drops trickle past her cracked lips. It was an act of such profound care that it solidified Eleanor's resolve into something as hard as the canyon rock. These children would not die today. Gaining the boy's trust enough to secure his sister in the rope was the next and greatest hurdle. Eleanor knew she couldn't rush it. She sat back from the edge, giving them space, but kept the rope taut in her hands, a physical manifestation of her presence. She spoke to them, not in words they would understand, but in a steady, calming monologue. She told them about Samuel, about his love for the rocks and the sky. She told them about her sheep and the stubborn squash in her garden. Her voice became a part of the landscape, a low, constant hum against the whisper of the wind. An hour passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and rose. The air grew cooler. Ataye'd had managed to sit up, leaning heavily against her brother. They had finished the water. Eleanor knew time was running out. She leaned over the edge again, her expression gentle. She pointed to the loop, then to the girl. "It's her turn," she said softly. "She's hurt. She needs to come up now." Ashki looked from Eleanor to the rope to his sister. Ataye'd coughed a dry, rattling sound that seemed to shake her entire frame. That sound was the deciding factor. With a look of grim determination, Ashki nodded a single, sharp dip of his chin. The process was agonizingly slow. Using gestures, Eleanor guided him. He managed to slip the loop around his sister's body under her arms. Eleanor instructed him to tighten it to make sure it was secure. He was clumsy, but meticulous. When he was done, he looked up at Eleanor, his face a mask of desperate hope. "I have her," Eleanor called down, her voice trembling slightly with the strain. "Now back away. Go to the canyon wall." He did as he was told, pressing himself against the rock, his eyes never leaving his sister's form. Eleanor wrapped the rope around her waist, dug her heels into the sandy soil, and began to pull. Her muscles screamed in protest. She was strong from her years of ranch work, but this was a different kind of strength. It was a dead weight, a precious, fragile weight. She pulled hand over agonizing hand, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The rope bit into her palms, stripping the skin. The world narrowed to the rope, the weight, and the sound of her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. Seconds stretched into minutes. Ataed's small body scraped against the rock face. A small cry of pain reached Eleanor, spurring her on. Gritting her teeth, she gave a final desperate heave. The girl's head appeared over the ledge, then her shoulders. Eleanor scrambled forward, never releasing the tension on the rope, and grabbed the girl's tunic, pulling her the rest of the way onto the solid ground. Ataed lay on the ground, limp and unconscious but breathing. She was safe. Eleanor's body slumped with relief, every muscle quivering. Blood trickled from her raw palms, dripping onto the thirsty ground. But it wasn't over. Down on the ledge, a small boy was waiting. Summoning a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, Eleanor sent the rope back down. Ashki, having watched his sister's ascent, was quicker to trust. He secured the rope around himself with a child's faith, his movements sure and certain. He was lighter than his sister, but Eleanor's muscles were now screaming with fatigue. Each pull was a fresh agony. As she hauled him up, the last of the sun's light vanished, plunging the world into the deep indigo of twilight. When Ashki was finally on solid ground, he didn't cheer or cry. He simply scrambled to his sister's side, placing his hand on her chest to feel the reassuring rise and fall of her breath. Only then did he look at Eleanor. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In his dark, solemn eyes, she saw a depth of gratitude so profound it was humbling. Getting them back to the ranch house was another ordeal. Ataed remained limp, a dead weight, in Eleanor's arms. Ashki, though exhausted, walked silently beside her, his small hand occasionally reaching out to touch his sister, as if to reassure himself she was still there. The short ride on Juniper felt like a journey across a continent. Inside the warmth of her home, Eleanor worked by the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. She gently cleaned the children's cuts and scrapes, her touch deft and gentle. She stripped away their wet, torn clothes and wrapped them in soft blankets. Ataed had a fever, her skin hot to the touch. Eleanor brewed a tea of willow bark, a remedy her own mother had used, and managed to get the girl to swallow a few sips. She made a thin corn gruel, and Ashki ate ravenously, his eyes constantly darting towards his sister, who lay on a pallet of blankets Eleanor had made by the hearth. After he had eaten, he refused the bed Eleanor offered him, choosing instead to curl up on the floor beside his sister's pallet, his hand resting on her arm. Within moments, he was asleep, his face finally looking like that of a child. Eleanor sank into a chair, the adrenaline that had fueled her for hours finally draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a throbbing pain in her hands. She looked at the two small figures sleeping by her fire, their dark heads stark against the pale blankets. They were a world of trouble she knew, a complication she could not afford. Yet as she looked at them, something deep within her, a part of her she thought had died, with Samuel began to stir. Her silent house was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft sound of two children breathing, and for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Vance did not feel entirely alone. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended reality. The world outside Eleanor's cabin remained unchanged. The sun rose, the canyon shadows shifted, the wind whispered its secrets, but inside, everything was different. The silence had been replaced by a new language, one spoken not with words, but with gestures, glances, and the cautious, tentative sounds of healing. Ataeid's fever broke on the second day. Eleanor, who had barely slept, watching over the girl, with a vigilance she hadn't felt in years, finally allowed herself a moment of relief. She had cleaned and bandaged the gash on the girl's leg, a nasty wound that could have easily turned septic. With clean dressings and Eleanor's constant care, it began to heal. The girl remained weak and withdrawn, her large, expressive eyes following Eleanor's every move with a kind of watchful curiosity. Ashki was her shadow. He was a boy caught between two worlds, the fierce, self-reliant protector of his sister and a small, lost child in a strange place. He helped Eleanor with her chores, his small hands trying to mimic her movements as she kneaded bread or fed the sheep. He would follow her to the chicken coop, his face a study in concentration, as he gathered the eggs, handling each one as if it were a precious jewel. He never spoke, but a silent communication began to grow between them. A nod when he wanted to show her a strange beetle he'd found, a slight shake of his head when she offered him coffee instead of milk. Eleanor learned their names through a simple game of pointing. She pointed to herself. Eleanor. She pointed to him. He remained silent. She tried again, patiently. Finally, he seemed to understand. He puffed out his small chest. Ashki. He said the word, a soft rush of air. He then pointed to his sleeping sister. Ataeid. The names felt like a gift, a key to a locked door. Ashki, Eleanor would say, and he would look at her, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Ataeid, she would whisper, and a ghost of a smile would touch the girl's lips. Despite the growing connection, a current of anxiety ran beneath the surface of Eleanor's every action. She knew their presence was a secret she could not keep forever. Their family would be searching for them. The Navajo were known for their resilience and their deep familial bonds. Two lost children would not go unnoticed. Every time she looked towards the vast expanse of the reservation that stretched north of her property, she expected to see a party of riders appearing on the horizon. But the more immediate threat lay in the other direction, towards the settlement of Chinle. Her nearest neighbors were the Connollys, a family of hardscrabble ranchers who held a deep-seated suspicion of anything and everything that was not like them. Jedediah Connolly, the patriarch, was a gaunt, bitter man, with eyes the color of a faded sky and a mouth that seemed permanently set in a sneer of disapproval. He viewed the Navajo with a mixture of fear and contempt, and he viewed the educated widow Vance with undisguised suspicion. Her encounter with him came on the fourth day. She had been forced to ride towards the Connolly's property to retrieve a stray ewe, a stubborn creature that had a knack for finding holes in the fencing. She had Ashki with her. It was a risk, but she couldn't leave him alone with his sister, still so weak, and he had refused to stay, his small face setting in a stubborn mask, until she had relented and lifted him onto the saddle in front of her. They found the ewe near a small creek that marked the boundary of their lands. As Eleanor was tying a lead rope to its neck, Jedediah Connolly appeared, materializing from a copse of cottonwood trees as if summoned by her anxiety. He was on horseback, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. His two lanky sons, Caleb and Micah, were with him, their expressions mirroring their father's sour disposition. Jedediah's pale eyes flickered from Eleanor to the small boy seated in front of her. He took in Ashki's dark hair, his Navajo features, and the plain, oversized shirt Eleanor had given him. A look of malevolent understanding dawned on his face. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice dripping with false civility. "Didn't take you for a squaw man, or squaw woman, I suppose." Eleanor felt a cold fury rise in her chest, but she kept her voice even. "Mr. Connolly, this is Ashkey. I'm looking after him for a time." "Looking after him?" Jedediah spat a stream of tobacco juice near the feet of Eleanor's mare, causing Juniper to skitter nervously. Ashkey pressed himself back against Eleanor, his small body rigid. "Or did you just find him? There's a word for that, Mrs. Vance. It's called stealin'. I found him and his sister stranded in a canyon after the storm," Eleanor said, her voice like ice. "They would have died if I hadn't brought them home. I am caring for them until their family can be located." Caleb, the oldest son, snickered. "Family? They're savages, Pa. They breed like rabbits. They won't miss a couple of runts." The casual cruelty of the remark struck Eleanor with physical force. She pulled back on Juniper's reins, her knuckles white. "These are children, Mr. Connolly, and they have a family. I am certain of it." "You're a fool woman," Jedediah sneered, his gaze hardening. "Playin' mother to a pair of Pache pups. You bringing them onto your land, you're inviting trouble. Not just for you, but for all of us. When their people come looking, they won't be coming with thanks. They'll come with knives and torches." "I am not afraid," Eleanor said, though a sliver of fear pricked at her. What if he was right? "You should be," Jedediah said, his voice low and menacing. "You're harboring things that don't belong here, and the law's got a name for that too. Marshal Thompson might be interested to hear about the company you're keeping." He gave Ashkey one last contemptuous look, then jerked his horse's head around. "You mark my words, Mrs. Vance, you'll regret this." The Connollys rode off, leaving a trail of poison in the air. Eleanor's hands trembled. She looked down at Ashkey. He was staring after the departing riders, his small face a mixture of fear and a startlingly adult defiance. He had understood the menace, if not the words. She turned Juniper around and rode for home, a sense of foreboding settling over her like a shroud. The encounter had changed everything. Her sanctuary was no longer safe. The whispers on the wind had found her, and they were beginning to sound like a threat. That night, as she watched the children sleep, she clutched the cool silver locket she always wore around her neck, the one that held a tiny portrait of Samuel. It was her one connection to a world of logic and reason, a world that felt very far away. She now had to protect these children, not just from the elements, but from the ignorance and hatred of men like Jedediah Connolly. The canyon had been the first test. She had a terrible feeling that the true trial was yet to come. Jedediah Connolly was a man who let his grudges fester, and he was true to his word. 2 days after their confrontation at the creek, Eleanor saw a plume of dust rising in the distance. It was not the scattered, aimless dust of a herd of sheep, but the singular, determined trail of a rider approaching at a steady pace. Her heart sank. It was too soon for the children's family to have tracked them here. This was a different kind of visitor. She stood on her porch, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron, a gesture of domesticity that felt absurdly out of place, with the dread coiling in her gut. She had already ushered a frightened Ashkey and a still-recovering Ataed into the small root cellar, the door concealed beneath a heavy rug in the main room. "Stay here and do not make a sound until I come for you," she had instructed them with a seriousness that they immediately understood. Ashkey had simply nodded his eyes, dark with worry, and pulled his sister into the cool darkness. The rider resolved into the familiar figure of Marshal John Thompson. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and a thick moustache that failed to conceal the weary set of his jaw. He was not an unkind man, but he was a man who believed in the letter of the law, a rigid framework, in a territory that was largely lawless. He saw the world in black and white, and Eleanor knew that her situation was a messy, inconvenient shade of grey. "Afternoon, Eleanor," he said as he swung down from his horse. He used her first name, a familiarity from the days when Samuel was alive, and they would occasionally share a coffee at the trading post. "Marshall," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "What brings you all the way out here?" Thompson took off his hat, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. He avoided her gaze, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Jedediah Connolly paid me a visit yesterday. He was concerned, spun a wild tale about you harboring a pair of Navajo runaways." Eleanor's chin lifted. "They are not runaways. Their names are Ashki and Ataed. I found them half dead in a side canyon. They were trapped by the flood." The marshal sighed, the sound heavy with the weariness of his office. "Eleanor, you know how things are. Tensions are high. The agency superintendent at Fort Defiance has been getting reports of children going missing. They think it's raiding parties from other tribes or worse. Connolly is stirring up trouble in Chinle, saying you stole them. He's talking about kidnapping." Kidnapping. The word was a slap. "I saved their lives, John. They would be dead." "I don't doubt your intentions," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "But intentions don't mean much when folks get spooked. You should have reported it immediately. You should have brought them to me." "And what would you have done with them?" Eleanor challenged, her voice rising. "A sick little girl and a terrified boy. Left them in a cell until someone from the agency decided to make the trip at Ayed, had a fever and a wound that needed tending. They needed care, not bureaucracy. They need to be with their own people," he countered, his tone hardening. "Look, I've already sent a rider to Fort Defiance to inform the agent. But in the meantime, I can't leave them here. It's not safe, not for them and not for you. Connolly's got folks riled up. If the children's family does show up looking for them and they find them here with you, it could get ugly. Folks might misunderstand. On all sides." A cold dread washed over Eleanor. He was going to take them. The thought was unbearable. She had spent every waking moment for the past week tending to them, nurturing them back from the brink. They had just begun to trust her. To take them now, to hand them over to strangers. "They are not ready to travel," she said, her voice pleading. "The girl is still weak." "I'll bring a wagon," Thompson said, his tone final. "I'll be back tomorrow morning. Have them ready. It's for the best, Eleanor. The law is the law." He turned to leave his duty done. But Eleanor was not finished. "The law," she said, her voice ringing with a sudden fierce conviction that surprised even herself. "Is the law always just John? Is it just to take two frightened children from the only safety they've known and hand them over to an indifferent system? Samuel used to say that the law was a tool, and like any tool, it could be used to build things up or to tear them down. Which are you doing here?" Thompson paused, his hand on his saddle. He looked back at her, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something behind the weary marshal's facade, a man who perhaps understood her dilemma more than he let on. "I'm trying to prevent a war," he said quietly. "Jedediah Connolly isn't the only one who sees a threat in every shadow. I'll be back in the morning." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Eleanor alone on her porch, the dust settling around her like the ashes of her hopes. The ultimatum hung in the air, "Be ready by morning." She went back inside and lifted the cellar door. Two small faces looked up at her, their eyes wide with questions they couldn't ask. She knelt down and gathered them into her arms, holding them tight. She could feel Ashki's small body trembling, and Ataeid leaned her head against Eleanor's shoulder. In that moment, Eleanor Vance made a decision. The law was coming. Fear and prejudice were coming. But she would not simply surrender these children. She had rescued them from the canyon. She would not let them be swept away by a flood of a different kind. She spent the rest of the day in a flurry of activity. She packed a small bag with food, water, and medical supplies. She checked the worn leather of Samuel's old saddlebags, ensuring they were still strong. She looked at the children, a desperate plan forming in her mind. She could run. She could take them into the labyrinthine canyons, try to find their people herself. It was a wild, foolish idea, a plan born of desperation. But what other choice did she have? That night, sleep would not come. She sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the canyon, its silvery light tracing the jagged edges of the rock. She clutched Samuel's locket, its familiar coolness a small comfort in the face of the impossible choice before her. The house was silent again, but this time it was a heavy, fearful silence, pregnant with the weight of the coming dawn. The law was coming to her door, and Eleanor Vance had to decide whether she would stand with the law or with the two small souls sleeping by her hearth. The morning arrived not with a gentle kiss, but with a bruised violet-gray light that seemed to bleed over the canyon rim. A storm was gathering its forces in the west, and the air, thick and heavy, carried a charge of anticipation, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Eleanor Vance had not slept. The desperate, frantic plans of the previous evening, of fleeing into the wilderness with the children, had dissolved with the coming of this grim daylight, exposed as the fantasies of a cornered animal. She was a rancher, not a fugitive. Her only recourse was not to run, but to stand. Her home, built by Samuel's hands, would be her fortress. Her conviction, forged in the rescue of two small lives, would be her shield. She moved through the quiet cabin with a deliberate calm that belied the frantic fluttering in her chest. She dressed the children in their warmest mended clothes. Ataeid, whose leg was now strong enough for her to walk without a limp, watched her with wide, trusting eyes. The light of childhood, so nearly extinguished, had begun to rekindle within her. Ashki was a different matter. He was preternaturally still, a miniature sentinel, whose face was set with a stoicism that was heartbreakingly at odds with his years. He understood, in the profound way a child can, that this day was a precipice, a moment after which nothing would be the same. Eleanor sat them at the small wooden table, the surface worn smooth by years of Samuel's elbows and her own. She ladled oatmeal into their bowls, a mundane act of domesticity that felt both absurd and essential. She added a rare drizzle of honey to each, a small offering of sweetness against the bitterness to come. As they ate in a silence, broken only by the scrape of their spoons, Eleanor's hand went to the silver locket at her throat. She drew it out, its weight a familiar comfort. On impulse, she opened it. The tiny, faded photograph of Samuel looked out of his expression, calm and intelligent, a man who saw the world as a series of solvable problems. She needed some of that certainty now. Ashki paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth, his gaze sharp and intense, fixed not on the photograph, but on the locket itself. He leaned across the table, his small brow furrowed in a knot of concentration, so fierce it seemed to command all the energy in his small body. He slowly extended a small, hesitant finger and touched the engraved back of the locket. Samuel, Eleanor whispered, thinking he was asking about the man in the picture. My husband. The boy shook his head with a sharp, impatient motion. This was not about the man. He tapped the locket's casing again, his finger tracing the intricate stylized lines of the soaring eagle Samuel had commissioned so many years ago. It was a symbol of his love for the wild freedom of this land, a secret flourish known only to them. Ashki looked up, his dark eyes burning with a sudden desperate urgency. He spoke a word, a torrent of guttural sounds and flowing syllables completely alien to Eleanor's ear. He pointed from the eagle engraving to his own chest, then to his sister, who had stopped eating to watch them. Ju ta ke, he repeated the phrase, a plea, a declaration. He was trying to build a bridge of understanding with the only materials he had, but the chasm of language between them was too wide. The meaning was lost, but the sheer force of his need to communicate was a tangible thing in the room. He was trying to give her a weapon, a key, and she could not grasp it. Before she could try to decipher his frantic message, the sound came. It began as a vibration in the floorboards, a low rumble that grew steadily into the distinct, dreaded rhythm of approaching horses. They were here. A cold calm settled over Eleanor. The time for fear was over. Stay inside, she said, her voice a low command that carried the weight of absolute authority. The children, sensing the shift in her, immediately obeyed. She walked to the door, her hand resting on the smooth wood for a fraction of a second, drawing strength from the house Samuel built. She took a deep breath of the heavy, storm-laden air and stepped onto the porch. Marshal John Thompson was not alone. He sat astride his horse, looking weary and uncomfortable, but it was the men with him that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Jedediah Connolly was there, a triumphant, predatory sneer twisting his thin lips. And on either side of him were his sons, Caleb and Micah, their dull faces mirroring their father's malice. They were not a posse, they were vultures come to watch a feast. The rifles held across their laps were not for protection, they were for intimidation, a blatant display of force meant to crush her spirit before the confrontation even began. Mornin' Eleanor, the marshal, said, his voice strained as he avoided her eyes. I see you're ready. I am not, she replied, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised her. She let her gaze sweep past him to settle on Jedediah Connolly. The man's sneer faltered for a second under the force of her contempt. What is the meaning of this, Marshal? I thought you were the one who upheld the law in this territory. They're a citizen's escort. Thompson mumbled the lie, sounding weak even to his own ears. Here to make sure things go smoothly, here to see the squaw lover get what's coming to her. Jedediah cackled, his voice sharp and cruel. Came to see you return stolen property, Mrs. Vance. As if summoned by the insult, the cabin door creaked open. Ashki stepped out first, his small frame rigid with defiance. He was followed a moment later by Ate-Ed. They did not cower or hide. Instead, they walked to Eleanor's side and stood, two small, silent figures against the dark wood of the house. Ashki's hand found the fabric of Eleanor's skirt and gripped it, a small anchor in a turbulent sea. Connolly's sneer widened into a grin of pure malice. Well, looky here, the whole cursed family. The marshal dismounted, his face grim, his movements stiff. Eleanor, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Let's get the children into the buckboard. We'll take them to the agent at Fort Defiance, and this will all be over. It will not be over for them, she shot back, the banked fire of her rage finally igniting. They will be terrified and alone. Can't you see that you are not protecting them? You are appeasing him. She spat. her chin jutting towards Connolly. "This isn't about the law, John. This is about you being afraid of a loud-mouthed bully and his ignorant sons. This is not justice. It is cowardice." The accusations struck home. A dark flush crept up Thompson's neck, and his jaw tightened. "That's enough. I am the law here, and I'm taking the children." He took a determined step towards the porch. Eleanor braced herself, shifting her body to better shield the twins. It was a hopeless, desperate tableau. A lone woman, her back against the wall, facing down 4 armed men. The world seemed to shrink to the space of that dusty yard, the air crackling with unspoken violence. And then a new sound. It was utterly different from the clumsy clatter of the marshal's party. This was a low, powerful drumming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was the sound of many horses moving as one, their hooves beating a thunderous rhythmic cadence that spoke of purpose and speed. Every head in the yard swiveled to the north, towards the vast open lands of the reservation. For a moment, there was nothing. Then they appeared. Cresting a low rise, they seemed to materialize from the land itself, a wave of riders that flowed over the horizon. There were at least a dozen of them, perhaps more. They were not painted for war. Their faces were not masks of aggression, but they were armed with rifles and bows, and they moved with the fluid, effortless grace of men who were born in the saddle. Their stern, impassive faces were set like stone, and their collective presence radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. At their head rode a man who commanded attention. His hair was streaked with silver grey, and his face, though etched with the lines of age and worry, was noble and severe. He carried himself not with the swagger of a gunslinger, but with the profound, quiet dignity of a king. They did not slow their pace until they reached the edge of the yard, where they reined in their ponies with a single fluid motion. They formed a silent, formidable semicircle, their horses breathing steam into the cool morning air. They had effectively trapped the marshal and his small, squalid posse between them and Eleanor's house. The air, already thick with tension, now felt as if it might split open. Jedediah Connolly and his sons, so full of bluster moments before, now seemed to shrink in their saddles, their faces turning a pasty, sickly white. The power dynamic in the yard had just shifted fundamentally and irrevocably. The lead rider's gaze, as sharp and penetrating as a hawk's, swept over the scene. It took in the nervous marshal, the cowering Connollys with their useless rifles, and finally came to rest on Eleanor and the 2 small children standing on her porch. As his eyes fell upon Ashki and Ataed, the iron severity of his expression softened, replaced by a wave of profound, overwhelming relief. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant, not in English, but in the melodic flowing language of the Diné. The sound of that voice, that language, broke the spell that had held Ashki frozen. He let go of Eleanor's skirt and darted from the porch, his small legs pumping as he ran across the yard. Shijeye Yazi. He cried out the words, a sob of pure relief. "My uncle." The man, Chief Hoskinini, swung down from his horse in a single seamless motion. He knelt on the hard-packed earth and caught the boy in his arms, crushing him in an embrace that spoke of sleepless nights and desperate prayers. His stern face broke, and he buried it in the boy's dark hair. Ataed followed her own small cry, joining her brothers, and their uncle enveloped them both, murmuring to them in their own tongue, his voice a low, soothing balm. After a long moment, Hoskinini rose, holding a child's hand in each of his own. He turned his attention to Eleanor. He studied her, his gaze taking in every detail, her defiant stance, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, her work-roughened hands, still red from hauling a rope, the simple dress, the determined set of her jaw. Then he looked at Marshal Thompson. "I am Hoskanini," he said. His English was accented, each word carefully chosen and delivered with immense weight. "These are my brother's children. We have been searching for them since the great storm washed away their trail. Their mother's heart is broken with grief." Marshal Thompson, a man accustomed to being the sole authority, was clearly outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. He cleared his throat. "Chief Hoskanini, there has been a misunderstanding. This woman, Mrs. Vance, she found them. We were just making arrangements to see them returned safely to the fort." Jedediah Connolly, seeing the marshal attempting to assert control, foolishly found his voice. "She stole 'em. That's what happened. She's a kidnapper." Hoskanini's head snapped toward him, and the warmth that had entered his eyes vanished, replaced by a fire so cold and dangerous it was terrifying to behold. "Be silent," he commanded. The two words, spoken without raising his voice, struck Connolly with the force of a physical blow. The man flinched, his mouth snapping shut, his bravado utterly collapsing into fear. Hoskanini turned back to Eleanor. At that moment, Ashki, still clinging to his uncle's hand, began speaking rapidly in Navajo. He gesticulated his free hand, pointing first at Eleanor, then jabbing emphatically at the silver locket that still hung around her neck, gleaming dully in the morning light. He repeated the phrase he had tried so desperately to make her understand earlier, his voice clear and certain, "Jew, Take." A look of utter astonishment washed over Hoskanini's face. He looked from the boy to the locket and back again. He asked a quick, sharp question in his own language. Ashki nodded vigorously, his entire body trembling with the importance of his message. The chief took a slow, deliberate step towards Eleanor, his expression transformed from relief to a dawning, profound awe. "He says, 'You wear the sign of the eagle,'" Hoskanini said to Eleanor, his voice now hushed with reverence. Eleanor's hand instinctively went to the locket. "It was my husband's," she said, her mind struggling to keep up with the turn of events. "It's just a design. To you, it is a design," Hoskanini said, his eyes fixed on the silver eagle. "To my people, to my own clan, it is Jew Take, the sign of the Eagle Mountain clan. It is the mark of our family. The boy says the eagle saved them from the canyon. He believes your husband's spirit sent you to them." The full weight of it descended upon her. The coincidence, the fate, the eagle that Samuel had loved for its freedom had become a symbol of family, of rescue, of kinship. Hoskanini looked from the locket to her face, and in that instant, he saw not a strange white woman, but an instrument of a power he understood and respected. He saw not a kidnapper, but a savior, who, guided by a sacred symbol she did not even recognize, had fulfilled a duty to his blood. He turned to his silent watching riders and spoke to them in Navajo. A murmur of understanding and deep respect passed through the men. Their stern faces softened, and they looked upon Eleanor not as an adversary, but with an honor that was humbling to behold. Hoskanini faced Eleanor one last time, his voice ringing with power and conviction, a proclamation for all to hear. "You did not steal my family," he declared. "You honored them. You saved the future of my clan. My debt to you is not a debt that can be paid with horses or blankets. It is a debt of blood and spirit." He then turned his powerful, unblinking gaze upon the marshal and the terrified, trembling Connollys. This woman lives on the land of our ancestors. From this day forward, she is under the protection of the Diné. She is Kay, our family, our friend. Any who threaten her, threaten us. Remember this day. Remember this warning. He held their gaze, letting the unbreakable vow sink into the silent yard. Marshal Thompson, his face a complex mixture of awe and relief, gave a slow, deliberate nod. He understood. Jedediah Connolly and his sons stared at the ground, their faces ashen, their power and hatred shriveled to nothing in the face of this ancient, unassailable law. The standoff was over, not broken by gunfire or threats, but dissolved by an act of courage and the impossible meaning of an eagle engraved on a silver locket. As Hoskanini gently led his niece and nephew to a spare horse, Eleanor Vance stood alone on her porch, her hand clutching the piece of silver at her neck, the cool metal, a conduit to a new and staggering reality. Her husband's legacy wasn't the house, the land, or the books he'd left behind. It was a bridge built not of wood or stone, but of compassion, respect, and a courage she never knew she possessed. The dust was settling, and in the quiet aftermath, Eleanor Vance's world, once so small and silent, had become immeasurably vast. Eleanor Vance's story is a powerful testament to the fact that true courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. In a time and place defined by division and prejudice, she chose compassion. Chief Hoskanini and his riders didn't just see a rescuer, they saw honor, and they answered it with their own. This forgotten piece of history reminds us that the bravest frontiers were not of land, but of the human heart. If this story of incredible bravery and the unlikely bonds forged in the heart of the Wild West moved you, please honor Eleanor's legacy by hitting that like button. Share this video with others so her story can continue to inspire. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey into the untold dramas that shaped America.